What does the Bible say about drinking alcohol? It doesn't take much study at all to learn first that the Bible very plainly says drunkenness is wrong. In Galatians chapter 5, we learn that being drunk is equated with idolatry, murder, and all sorts of other bad things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we learn that drunkards cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. We could go on, but God obviously views drunkenness as a sin, one that can keep us out of heaven. That said, people are drinking wine all over the place in the Bible, so moderate drinking must be just fine, as long as you're responsible and don't get drunk, right? Let's take a closer look. The Apostle Paul says he was stoned once. Today, that means one thing, of course, but back then it meant something completely different. This is called semantic shift, and it happens rather commonly in languages over time. Here are some other examples. That same thing has happened with the word wine. Today it means a strongly alcoholic drink, but until recently wine regularly meant pure sweet juice or vinegar, as well as grapes that are still on the vine. You can follow the shift in definitions over time in the Bible, in ancient literature, as well as the oldest English dictionaries ever made. From ancient days, thousands of years ago, Aristotle in his Meteorologica in the 300s BC specifically refers to grape juice or must as wine. Pliny, the 1st century AD, wine, or vinum in Latin, is used of fresh, sweet grape juice. Aeglucus vinum, sweet wine, sapa indifrutum among the vinum dulce, sweet wine. He also mentions other kinds of unfermented sweet wines known as permanent must, raisin wine, and honey wine. All the way through to the more recent history, in the 1600s and 1700s, Theatrum Botanicum. The juice or liquor pressed out of the ripe grapes is called vinum, wine. The juice of the grape is called wine. The New World of English words. Must, Latin, wine, newly pressed from the grape. Glossographica Anglicana Nova, must, sweet wine, newly pressed from the grape. Then in the 18 and 1900s, the definition began to shift. Webster's International Dictionary of the English Language of 1898 says wine, the expressed juice of grapes, especially when fermented, a beverage or liquor prepared from grapes by squeezing out their juice and usually allowing it to ferment. To today, where the definition has narrowed primarily to mean fermented wine. Most of the confusion about what the Bible teaches about drinking alcohol stems from this unnoticed semantic shift. They drank wine, so I can drink wine. Just like when Paul was stoned, if we swap in modern definitions to ancient words, we can make big mistakes. But they had no refrigerators to keep the juice fresh, so it had to be alcoholic, right? This is a common assumption today, but it's not true. Before we can show why that's the case, let's explore how wine is made. First, you start with a sweet liquid that is pressed out of a fruit. It's mostly water and glucose and fructose. This is relatively unstable because naturally occurring yeasts that float in the air or live on the skin of the fruit will pretty quickly begin to metabolize the fructose or glucose and create ethanol, alcohol, as well as carbon dioxide. And this is also rather unstable. Shortly after that, Acetobacter bacteria in the air also begin metabolizing ethanol into acetic acid, turning it into vinegar or sour wine. Vinegar was easy to make. Just do nothing to the juice, and in a matter of weeks, you'd have vinegar. It will keep essentially forever. Juice was likewise easy to keep because high sugar content inhibits bacterial growth. This is why honey and syrup can be left out at room temperature without spoiling. As long as the water content is low, sweet juice is quite easy to preserve. And we see fresh juice was commonly boiled in ancient times immediately after pressing, reducing the water content and increasing the sugar concentration. The heat would also kill any fungus or yeasts, and the high sugar concentration would inhibit bacterial growth. It would keep, again, essentially forever. But for fermented wine, there were two main difficulties in regard to its preservation: fungus on one end and bacteria on the other. So rather than the easiest or default way to keep the drink, fermented wine was actually the most difficult stage of the juice to properly preserve. As it fermented, it had high water content because it wasn't boiled to kill the yeast that they needed, and low sugar because the yeast eats the sugar to make alcohol. And so, fermented wine was a perfect breeding ground for both fungus and bacteria seeking to ruin it. Ancient people could certainly do it, but that's a far cry from assuming that fermented wine was easy or the default mode of wine. They had numerous methods of preserving their produce at any point along the way, be it juice, fermented, or vinegar. Aristotle speaks of how wines are intentionally boiled, sometimes so thick that it had to be scraped off of a skin, as if it was obvious and common knowledge. He specifically refers to grape juice or must, glucose, as one of the kinds of wine. Lucius Columella also writes with incredible detail of various methods for harvesting and preserving juice, and specifically says that the juice keeps good forever. It was common knowledge in ancient times of numerous ways to preserve grape juice: boiling, filtration, cold storage, sulfur fumigation, smoke, tar, dehydration, seawater salts, or mixing other preservatives. Varro, Aristotle, Virgil, Josephus, Polybius, Hippocrates, Celsus, and many more all write of the many ways that ancients had to preserve, and quite frequently their preference for, non-intoxicating wine, pure, sweet grape juice. The argument that they had no way to preserve fresh juice is a historically ignorant anachronism. So with that groundwork laid, let's take a look at what the New Testament says about drinking. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 18, Paul identifies drunkenness not as an end, but as a process. How so? The word drunk is an inceptive verb in the Greek. An inceptive verb is a special kind of verb that shows a process of beginning or becoming. An example of an inceptive verb that we use today is the word thaw. Imagine you had chicken in the freezer. That chicken is not thawed. When does that chicken begin the process of thawing out? When the meat is taken out of the freezer, it begins the process of thawing. The longer it is out of the freezer, the more thawed it becomes. The thawing doesn't begin at some late stage. Thawing begins when it is first taken out of the freezer and continues from there. So, to draw the parallel, instead of some chicken in the freezer, imagine a person that has not had any drinks. He is sober. That person has not begun the process of becoming drunk. When does that process begin? When a toxin is ingested, that person begins the process of drunkenness or intoxication. That's the simple meaning of the word. The more intoxicant that is ingested, the further into the state of drunkenness they get. The drunkenness doesn't begin at some late stage of drinking. Drunkenness begins when the first drink is taken and continues from there. People today redefine drunkenness as a late stage of intoxication. But Paul identifies drunkenness as a process. When someone starts drinking, they begin the process of drunkenness. The existence of drunkenness or intoxication is not determined by the amount that someone drinks. The degree of drunkenness is. So, in other words, Paul is saying, don't even begin the process of intoxication. That is the force of the grammar in the original Greek. But like anything else, it is sometimes easy for people to soften sin. If someone commits adultery, they'll come up with a new name to make it sound less bad. They'll call it a fling. When someone lies, we say it's a fib, or we're stretching the truth, or it's a little white lie. People tend to make themselves feel better about sin by calling it a different name. So what do people do with drunkenness? They say they're buzzed, or tipsy, or chatty, or they're getting loosened up instead. It's just a nice way of saying that you're intoxicated. Biblically speaking, drunkenness is not a late stage of drinking. It is a process that begins when you take the first drink. Society today has redefined drunkenness. You don't have to be passed out in the gutter to be drunk. The Bible defines drunkenness as an inceptive process. Next, let's take a look at the word sober. Modern people define sober as not completely intoxicated. The Bible, however, describes sober as complete abstinence from drinking. The lexicographer Gerhard Kittel says, "It is compelling that the Greek word for sober, self-controlled, in numerous passages is a word that also means holding no wine." Biblical scholar W.E. Vine says, "Nepho, sober, signifies to be free from the influence of intoxicants, and to abstain from wine." John MacArthur says, "Nephalios, temperate, literally means wineless or unmixed with wine." So any amount of social drinking would break these numerous commands to be sober as well. That said, there are a few passages commonly used to support drinking in moderation. First, let's start with Jesus made wine in John chapter 2. As already demonstrated, wine was a generic word, fermented or unfermented. So whatever Jesus made, it was over 120 gallons, and he gave no restriction on its usage, even after the guests had already well drunk. If this was alcoholic, he would have broken the spirit, if not the letter, of both the Old Testament law as well as his New Testament law. His presence there at a drinking party, much less participating and contributing to it, would have caused him to be guilty of sin according to 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3. Thus we know the occasion was innocent and free from the influence of alcohol. It seems more reasonable that he made sweet, fresh wine. What about where the Bible says deacons and older women are allowed to drink a little? This is an error of seeing restriction against excess as authority for partaking in moderation. A parallel would be when the Bible says don't be overly wicked, and saying it's okay to be a little bit wicked. Or when the Bible says an excess of riot is wrong. That means a little bit of riotous living is okay. Or that abominable idolatries is wrong, so that means that a little idolatry is okay. No, these things are condemned in excess and in moderation. This is simply how ancient writers sometimes spoke, using the natural language and idioms of their day. Again, restriction against excess cannot be taken as authority for moderation. What about Deuteronomy chapter 14? It says, "Spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or strong drink, for whatever your heart desires, you shall eat there before the Lord your God." The problem here is that strong drink in some translations is not a translation. If Moses wanted to say strong drink, there are other Hebrew words he could have used. The actual Hebrew word used here is shakar. The OED traces the etymology of shakar to the Greek sikera, then to the French cidre, to our modern English word cider. Older translations of shakar confirm this as well, such as the Wycliffe Bible from the 1300s. In Proverbs 31 and Judges 13, the word is translated cider. Alternatively, shakar could be translated as sweet drink. Grammatically, the Hebrew word shakar is where we get our word sugar, via the more modern Middle French and English sucre. It's related to the Arabic sukar and the Persian shakar and Sanskrit sharkara, all words for sugar. It's precisely the sugar in the liquid that made it distinctive and even possible to be fermented. Every fermented drink must have started out as an anodyne sweet beverage before any fermentation could have started. It could become fermented, but to assume that it exclusively or always meant this is literally incorrect. We even denote the ambiguity of cider by saying cider or hard cider. This is the same flexibility that shakar has. Just as wine is a general word for all types of beverages made from grapes, fermented and unfermented, shakar seems to indicate juices made from other fruit. The New King James Version regularly renders it as similar drink. Well, what about Proverbs 31? It says, "Give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be heavy of heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more." This is clearly talking about intoxicating beverages. Well, that's true. But notice first the verses right before that passage. It forbids kings from drinking wine or strong drink, period. Mind-altering drugs that take away judgment are not fit for responsible, thinking people. As the Talmud indicates, this passage is not talking about drinking away your sorrows, but about alcohol being only fit as a sedative for someone being executed, and it is to be administered by others, not self-medication. The court gives one who is being led out to be killed a grain, koret, of frankincense and a cup of wine in order to confuse his mind and thereby minimize his suffering from the fear of his impending death. As it is stated, "Give strong drink to him that is ready to perish, and wine to the bitter in soul." This is not permission for social drinking, but mercy for the condemned. Well, didn't Paul tell Timothy to drink wine? Timothy had stomach problems, and the alcoholic content of fermented wine could help disinfect bad water, right? Well, that's the claim. Problem is, that's just not true. Alcohol works pretty well as a topical antiseptic in very high concentrations. That's what hand sanitizer is. But science shows that when diluted below 50%, alcohol is basically useless as an antiseptic. Not only that, but alcohol doesn't work for all germs, such as norovirus and Colostrum difficile, which can cause life-threatening diarrhea, or Cryptosporidium, a parasite that causes a diarrheal disease called cryptosporidosis, the very sorts of things that Timothy was suspected of having. Further, ancients were not ignorant. They knew to use clean containers. They knew good and bad places to obtain water, such as rainwater and fresh spring water was good, and seawater that was close to the shore tended to be bad, and that bad water could be easily purified if it was properly boiled. Paul clearly wasn't talking about sterilizing bad water with alcohol, as some people claim. It was a common practice to take small amounts of boiled down grape juice or pulp to settle stomachs. Even today, grape juice can be used to alleviate stomach conditions, especially when watered down. Paul very likely was referring to grape juice or paste, which has vitamins and other properties that could settle his stomach. Even ignoring all of that, prior to Paul's instruction here, Timothy as a faithful Christian was abstaining from any wine entirely. Paul says, "No longer drink only water," and it took the direct injunction of an apostle of Christ for Timothy to do otherwise, even in light of his frequent infirmities. Second, this is far from condoning social drinking, because the amount was to be a little, and the implication is it was to be diluted in his water. This purpose was very specifically medicinal in nature and not social, casual, or recreational. So what do we make of the Bible, where it sometimes condemns wine, but other times calls wine a blessing? A popular answer is that wine in moderation is a blessing and wine in excess is condemned. The problem with this conclusion is that the passages counting wine as a blessing do so without regard to moderation, and the passages that condemn wine do so in any amount. When the semantic shift of the word wine is taken into account, as well as the ancients' ability to preserve and their frequent preference for sweet juice, the conclusion must be that in a time where sweet things were not nearly as common as today, fresh, sweet juice was indeed a joy and a blessing, and the bitter, mind-altering drug was condemned, not only in any amount, but even to look at. Christians ought to remain sober and not even start the process of drunkenness, just as the Bible says. If you have any questions about this or any other biblical topic, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you.